Our speaker, Noe Torres, will be joined by Alex, Macon, and Stratton Horres. Alex is a local writer. His articles have appeared in D Magazine, Texas Monthly, and then Stratton, he has been to places in the world that they no longer let people in, like some of the ancient temples and so forth, ancient sites. Because people were ruining them, they said, we can't let people in anymore. And he's gone into Egypt, down into the catacombs and so forth. Places. So I've seen his pictures. I vicariously experienced the joys of what he's done. Noe has written how many books? 30. That's what I thought. I mean, I can tell you, I've never written a book, but I've written a lot of magazine articles, and I can tell you how long it takes to write a magazine article. He's written 30 books. I just know how he's done it. You must not eat or sleep. One advantage that Noe has over a lot of people who write books, he has a master's degree in library science, which means he's taught from the first class, first morning, how to evaluate whether this is a tertiary source, a secondary source, or a primary source, and the credibility of those sources. So when he writes something, it's not because he heard it from grandma or heard it on the street, although a lot of good stories come from grandma and the street. He knows how to collaborate those facts, verify those facts before he puts it in print. So when he puts something in print, as we say down home, it's the truth. And now, with that said, please turn off your cell phones because we have a virtual audience watching as we speak. And after the program, after the presentation, Alex and Stratton will come up here, and they will help moderate the Q&A. We will not take questions during the presentation, but after the presentation, we are open to all the questions you have. It's my honor to introduce Noe Torres.
Thank you. I really appreciate Tom and all the staff and all the supporters of the Allen Public Library for having me here tonight. This is a beautiful facility, by the way. It's one of the most fantastic libraries, public libraries that I've been to in the state of Texas. And I've been to a lot of them. And I've been a librarian for over 30 years myself. Have a master's degree in library science from the University of Texas at Austin. And I've been in the field for a long time. So doing research, doing library-based research is how I came into the study of UFOs, which is a topic that always interested me. And then there was a significant sighting that happened in my family, my mother, in the 1940s, which also drew my attention to the topic. So tonight, I'm going to talk about something that a lot of UFO researchers haven't spent much time with, but I think it's highly relevant to an overall view of unidentified flying objects in America over the course of time. We hear a lot about recent cases, and I'm going to talk just briefly about how the interest in UFO keeps growing every day. There's been a couple of very significant developments in recent weeks and months. You may have heard, I'm sure, it's been all over the media. It's been covered in all the major media, the stories I'm going to talk about briefly. But my aim tonight is to demonstrate to you how my research-based approach to UFO cases that took place before most people think that the UFO era began, which is in the late 1940s, specifically 1947, when sightings suddenly exploded, and on into the 50s and 60s and to the present day. But they're actually, my research partner, John LeMay, a historian from Roswell, New Mexico, and I have found hundreds of cases that occurred prior to 1947, and these fascinate us because you never hear about these. It was the assumption for most people that look into UFO cases is that it all began in the 40s, and there was a deep, dark nothing, a big void prior to 1947 and the Roswell UFO crash. But in actuality, there was quite a lot going on, as we will see tonight. I'm going to highlight just a few chapters from my 3 latest books, which are UFOs of the early 20th century, covering the period from 1900 to 1919, then UFOs of the Roaring '20s, and then my latest book is my book on the 30s, the 1930s, the turbulent 30s, as I call them. Turbulent because the U.S. was about to enter World War II. There was some interesting developments going on and that impacted the war, as I'll talk about, and other factors. So I'm going to talk just a little bit about myself to give you an idea here. Okay, so some of this I've already mentioned. I'm very involved with the Mutual UFO Network, which is a volunteer group of individuals throughout the world who follow UFO cases, who do investigations. They train to become field investigators, and they follow up when people have a sighting or an encounter. So I've been involved with the Mutual UFO Network for a number of years, and I am a former state section director for South Texas, and as has already been mentioned, I'm a librarian, researcher, and a technology specialist. I've written 30 books, most of them having to do with UFO cases prior to what is known as the modern era. My co-conspirator in writing these books is a wonderful young man, John LeMay. He's a board member and past president of the Historical Society for Southeast New Mexico. And I was presenting at the annual Roswell UFO Festival, which is held every year in Roswell. If you all, how many of you have been to the Roswell UFO Festival? If you have not, I highly recommend it. It's on everybody's list of things you should do before you die, and Roswell is one of the places you should go. It's fascinating. I was invited to speak in Roswell. I've been invited to speak at the annual festival on several years in a row. It was during one of my presentations in Roswell at the Roswell UFO Museum that I met John LeMay the first time. This was many years ago. And he and I linked up. He had an interest in, he approached me after my talk and he said, I have an interest in UFO cases that happened like way back, like a long time ago. And it turns out that he's very much into the historical record, documentation. He has access to a lot of historical material in his capacity with the Historical Society. And so we ended up putting together our very first book in 2011, which was a young adult book called The Real Cowboys and Aliens. We were trying to piggyback onto the big movie release at that time, Cowboys and Aliens, Spielberg movie. And so we were answering the question, back in the 1800s during the Old West, were there actual UFO cases reported? And our book, we feel, answered that question for folks. Real cases documented in print, with documentation in print that you can go and look up yourself. It wasn't just hearsay. And so that book ended up being very popular. It was very well reviewed. And what followed was a series of books, just a whole bevy of books having to do with UFOs in early American history. And these are a few of them. We followed up with books about the whole period of time in the 1800s, the whole 19th century, from 1800 to 1899, including the airship sightings of the late 1800s, which included the very significant case that happened near here in Aurora, Texas, the crash of a strange object in the middle of town, and the recovery of a body that the media said was of an inhabitant not of this earth. And my friend who's here with us tonight, Daniel Jones, he is also another big-time investigator into the Aurora crash. If you have questions about Aurora, he's a great person to talk to. We collaborated with Jim Mars on several occasions. Jim Mars, of course, was the #1 expert on the Aurora UFO crash. So anyway, this is a little bit by way of talking about my background. Now I'm going to briefly just mention, as I said, the UFO topic keeps growing in popularity. And people come up to me after I speak and they say, well, it's all these alien movies. It's all these alien video games. Kids are into aliens. And, well, I think it's the answer or the explanation is much more complex than that. It's not science fiction. It's not the media's coverage of the possibility of extraterrestrial life. It's actual people having these strange encounters on a daily basis all over our country and all over the world. It's people's feeling about the encounter that they've had. Almost everybody, when I give a talk, there's usually a big group of people that wants to discuss their own personal sighting or the sighting that someone in their family or a close family or friend that has had. So it's a very widespread and omnipresent phenomenon that touches everybody's lives. It's way beyond something that's based on fiction or the media. Recently, more and more people seem to be talking about UFOs and extraterrestrial intelligence. I don't know if you all heard about this gentleman, a former United States Air Force intelligence officer, who has given a series of interviews stating that the U.S. government has recovered extraterrestrial craft that have crashed. And some of these craft have been recovered intact, and some of them have been recovered in fragments. The military, he says, has even recovered the dead bodies of the pilots of these craft. Now, one of the stories I'm going to tell you is a fascinating account from one of my books that happened back in the 1930s, where there was a supposed recovery of a UFO and its occupants, and they were taken to Washington, D.C., and locked in a top secret area basement of the Capitol building. So I'll be sharing that with you tonight. But that's one thing that's been in the news lately, and another one some of you may have heard, because it's been on all the major news media, and a lot of discussion on the social media as well. There was a case, a very interesting case in Las Vegas. It has yet to be explained, where there was an object that descended out of the sky, a glowing orb type object, descended out of the sky and was captured on the body cam of a police officer. And then later in the neighborhood where this object descended, the residents of a home there told officers that they saw these strange humanoid beings in their backyard, possibly as tall as 10 feet tall. So just further evidence that there continues to be a very strong interest in these types of cases, these paranormal events. We don't know exactly what these entities are, what their point of origin is. A lot of times it's all conjecture when you hear UFO people on TV shows giving what they think that these creatures are all about. It's all conjecture. It's speculation. The big mystery is that we don't know we don't even know what the mystery is. We just know that people see them. It happens in our time. It happened in the times past, as my research for my books has indicated. It's something that has gone back even before, even way before the books series of books I've been doing started in the 19th century, but it goes way beyond that. So just focusing more on the research that I'm presenting tonight, as I mentioned, a lot of UFO researchers don't see a lot of significance to the time period that I'm going to cover tonight, 1900 to 1939. You hear a lot about UFOs in ancient times, ancient aliens. How many seasons of Ancient Aliens have we had, Daniel? 17. Oh my God, I lost track after 2 or 3. I was a big Erich von Däniken fan in the 1970s. How many people remember Erich von Däniken? Yeah. Chariots of the Gods and all the sequels. Loved it. Erich von Däniken is a Facebook friend of mine. I've corresponded with him on Facebook Messenger. He's a great guy. He still speaks. He's around 90, I believe, Daniel, 80s. So people talk about ancient aliens. They talk about, the time period from the year 1600 to 1800. We hear about occasional sightings, signs and wonders in the sky. People did not have the modern terminology that we have, such as rocket ships and, all the terminology that we use today. There was no such thing. Science fiction had not been born yet. And so they describe these things as miracles or signs and wonders in the sky. And that was a time period of 1600 to 1800. Now, beginning with the 19th century, and this is the reason that John LeMay and I became so fascinated with how many UFO sightings there were during the 19th century, during the founding, the early days of the United States, during the Wild West period, and then the latter part of the 1800s, when we had the so-called airships all over the United States being reported. From 1800 to 1899, unexplained aerial phenomenon. There were the first reports of contact with extraterrestrial in our, more or less modern era, which, I'm using here 1800 and onward. So we started seeing reports of people who encountered, like these people we just saw in the video, strange beings of different descriptions. Some of them resemble what UFO witnesses call the grays, the gray aliens. Others, not so much that description, but more or less humanoid. Most of them are humanoid in shape, different sizes, different descriptions. Then I'm going to skip the part that's highlighted on this next slide. Sorry, there we go. Okay, so we're talking about pre-biblical and biblical times, and 1600 to 1800, then 1800 to 1899. And I'm going to skip the part that's highlighted because that's what I'm going to talk about next. But 1940 to the present, there was an explosion of UFO sightings all over the world and here in the United States. We were a leader because we had really good media outlets. There was really good coverage. Tom and I were talking about how, I was telling him that we rely so heavily on the periodicals of the time period in which these events happen in our books. We go back and we look at the published material documenting these incidents that occurred in the 1800s and onward. Many times there were multiple newspapers covering the same event in that time period, so we can look at different angles. The Aurora UFO incident, for example. There were several instances, several different newspapers, several different reporters who covered that from a slightly different perspective. So, yes, 1940 to the present, big explosion, thousands of sightings annually, beginning around 1947. Roswell UFO crash, July 1947, commemorated every year in Roswell, New Mexico. The Kenneth Arnold sightings earlier in 1947, which was supposedly the first mention of the term flying saucer, although it actually had previously occurred in UFO historical research. But so when people talk about UFO research, they want to start in the 1940s. And John LeMay and I go around the country speaking and telling people, you have to start before 1947, folks. You have to look at what was going on before that. And I've already mentioned my interest in the Aurora UFO case. Roswell, New Mexico, crash of a UFO north of town, actually quite a bit north of town. I've been in Roswell quite a lot, and visitors come up to me and say, can you show me or tell me where the crash happened? And then I tell them, well, you have to drive 100 miles north of the Roswell city limits into the middle of the desert, where you'll see nothing but rocks, lizards, and a few stray cattle. Because that's where the Foster Ranch crash location was. Has anybody been to the Foster Ranch in Roswell, New Mexico? It's a fascinating place to visit. The Sci-Fi Channel put a big marker there, signifying that an unidentified craft not of earthly origin is said to have crashed here at this site. Very beautiful marker. I had a picture of it somewhere. I don't know if I brought it. But anyway, interestingly enough, there's a exact 50-year gap or separation between these two famous UFO crashes. Aurora, April 17th, 1897, and Roswell, New Mexico, July 1947. So, take that for whatever significance that might be, but there are some cycles that people study about when these major events happen and where they happen. The latitude, the longitude. Are they contained within a certain geographical area of the United States, and so forth? Here on the screen, you see the my laser pointer doesn't seem. Oh, there it is. Okay, this is the actual newspaper from right after the crash. The Roswell Army Airfield captures flying saucer on ranch in Roswell region. And then this on the left is the original blurb that appeared in the Dallas Morning News. Alex, your paper, I think, you were with it, but not in 1897, I take it. So, and my friend Daniel has done some interesting research into the author, S.E. Hayden, of this article. You actually found his gravesite, right?
Well, we're looking for that one, but the person who is also mentioned, who describes the remains of the gathered remains.
Oh, yeah, Mr. T.J. Weems, right?
Weems is buried also here in the area.
That's mentioned right here. Mr. T.J. Weems of the United States Signal Service officer. He says that it's his opinion that the creature that was found in the wreckage of the UFO was a native of the planet Mars. Such was the astronomical knowledge of that time, of course. Okay. So you actually found the gravesite for Mr. J.T. Weems. And we're trying to track down Hayden.
He could be here, it could be California. There's little record to show where he was actually buried.
So that's why all this historical stuff fascinates us, because you can backtrack it, do forensic analysis, and find exactly either verify or discredit these stories. We had a wonderful event in Aurora a few years back. Daniel and I were helped to organize it along with our friend, the late, great Jim Mars. We had the Aurora Alien Encounter, which was held April 16th, 2016. And there's Jim Mars, wonderful Texas treasure, who unfortunately passed away too soon. He was also a former Dallas Morning News reporter. So he was the world's leading expert on the Aurora UFO encounter, as well as many other UFO cases at the time. Anyone know who this gentleman is? Travis Walton, a famous UFO abductee who was taken aboard a UFO for a week. There's been efforts to discredit his story for decades, and nobody has been able to. He was one of our featured speakers. So this was a wonderful event, and we were hoping that the city of Aurora would continue it, but we ran into some logistical issues, and maybe in the near future we can revive that. Okay, so I'm going to give you just a few of the cases in my 3 books. First of all, I have the book of UFO cases from the early 20th century. This book we called Early 20th Century UFOs, 1900 to 1919. And we were surprised when we started to put this book together at how many cases we found. Significant cases, not just a light in the night sky. What was it? Could have been aliens. No, nothing like that. It was actual documented with print material documenting what happened, in many cases from multiple news sources. So one of the first interesting stories happened to a naval ship. Now, the past few days we've been hearing about the involvement of the U.S. and Canadian naval vessels in the investigation to find the downed submersible, which unfortunately was lost with all hands on board, as you all have heard. But this happened way back in 1904 near San Francisco, and it involved a U.S. Navy ship called the USS Supply, which was sailing about 300 nautical miles from San Francisco Bay. And it had already traveled quite a distance from Honolulu and was closing in on the California coast when the members of the crew saw an amazing spectacle, a formation of very large UFOs that moved rapidly toward the ship's position from north to northwest. So the description of the objects caught our attention because, there are a lot of things that can be mistaken for unexplained, unidentified flying objects that are commonplace, but the descriptions of what happened here, it's remarkable. The 3 objects were bright red in color, the witnesses said. These are naval sailing men, hardened sailors, experienced. So they were bright red in color, the largest being egg-shaped and about 6 times the size of the sun in the sky. The second and third objects were round rather than egg-shaped, and the object showed no imperfections in shape. The second object was about twice the size of the sun, and the third object was about the same size as the sun observed from the earth. This is a picture there of the actual ship that had this encounter, U.S. Navy ship USS Supply. So the media accounts, and we found quite a number, but the media accounts of the day in the headlines describe these objects as meteors, wondrous meteors. But that's not what the sailors said that they saw. In fact, they were very clear that these experienced sailing men were clear that what they saw were not meteors. The formation of UFOs rising from below the clouds to well above the clouds zoomed over the ship, being at one point perhaps a mile above it and viewable at a 45-degree angle from the deck. After zooming past the ship, they continued toward the west-northwest and shifted to a 75-degree angle in the sky. The sighting lasted about 2 minutes, and no satisfactory explanation was ever given as to what the objects could have been. And we looked up a number of newspaper articles from the day. It's just astonishing how much data there is in the periodicals of the day. You can actually trace, and we've done this, of course, in our research, not just the event itself, but all of the people mentioned in the events, which then leads us to genealogical records, birth and death records. We go back and we make certain that these are real people, not a spoof story that some reporter made up. We go back and we try to determine every person mentioned in the article, did they exist? From what time to from what year to what year did they live, and so forth. It's part of the research that we do. Another very interesting event from the early 20th century, there was an explosion of a strange object in Burlington, Vermont, July 2nd, 1907, at about 11 o'clock. A strange object appeared in the downtown area of Burlington, and it was witnessed by a Catholic bishop named John Michaud, who was standing about 300 feet west of the object. It was dark in color and was torpedo-shaped. Now, that's an unusual thing to see hovering in the sky above your town in 1907. Stationary in the air, hovering about 50 feet above the tops of the nearest buildings, the object appeared, and I didn't advance the next slide, sorry. The object appeared to be crackling with electricity. Now, that's an interesting observation. And we look for observations such as this, something extremely out of the ordinary. The object that was seen there appeared to be built up with electricity. In fact, the witnesses said that they could feel the electricity surging through them. And there were tongues of fire issuing from spots on the surface resembling red-hot, unburnished copper. So Michaud, the observer, the Roman Catholic bishop, said the object was surrounded by a halo of dim light some 20 feet in diameter. Although it was stationary when it was first observed, he saw it begin to move rather slowly to the south. Now, this is very interesting detail coming up. To the observer, it looked like the object suddenly caught fire and might have blown up. And they looked for particles or debris and found none. But in actuality, what we think happened is that the object turned around and engaged its propulsion system, which is what he saw flaring outward toward him, and then it was gone. Because they never found anything at all to indicate as far as debris or anything. So there was, the object moved, its outer covering or hull seemed rupturing in places, and through these the intensely red flames issued. There ensued an explosion, the witness thought. We think it was the propulsion system of the craft as it zoomed away. Another interesting case. When people talk about the abduction of UFO witnesses by supposed extraterrestrials or whatever these entities are, the people, they come and they abduct human beings and conduct some sort of research on them. We don't know exactly what the aim is there. But when we think of abductions, we think of the 1960s. Betty and Barney Hill in the early 1960s was probably the world's biggest first UFO abduction case. 1963, was it? 61, Betty and Barney Hill. So, but actually, we found record of abductions taking place as far back as the 1800s. There was an abduction attempt in the 1860s, although the people that were being chased by the beings, these beings, strange beings, were able to get away. And then there was the amazing case in 1911 in Ohio of a lady named Elsie Fox, who told the story. She told the story to world-famous UFO researcher J. Allen Hynek. J. Allen Hynek was an astronomer and UFO researcher whose career is renowned in the field of UFO research. His work was partly used in the movie Close Encounters of the Third Kind, Steven Spielberg. The story that Elsie Fox Shirley told J. Allen Hynek happened to Shirley's sister, Idella Fox Ford, who lived from 1876 to 1913 in Pequot, Ohio, Union County. And we did the research. These were actual people. This was an actual incident. On May 11th, Idella Ford boarded a train to visit her grandmother who lived 40 miles away. She boarded this train to visit her grandmother 40 miles away in Broadway, Ohio. And after arriving in Broadway, she was in an extremely emotional and stressful appearance. She had obviously been through something extremely devastating to her. And she eventually told family members that they had come from the sky to take her, and she lived the rest of her life in fear of these mysterious beings that might someday come back and take not only her, but other members of her family. More specifically, she was terribly frightened that the beings would destroy her and her family. There you see the 2 points, the short voyage she was making from Pequot to Broadway, Ohio, May 1911. And another very interesting part of this story is that Idella Ford, the lady who claimed she was abducted, had strange marks on her body that apparently resulted from her abduction. Evidence showed that something very hot had seared her face. Her tongue was strangely swollen. On her calves, there were 3 indentations made seemingly by pressure from fingers. Was some hand that only had 3 fingers. And interestingly, gray aliens are often said to only have 3 fingers and 1 thumb on each hand. So unfortunately, the Idella Ford story ends very tragically because in 1911, alien visitation and alien abduction and unidentified flying objects were unknown. And people who came forward with stories like this were not very well looked upon by the people of that era. So people concluded that Idella was not well in the head. And her own mother concluded that her daughter was insane, and she had her committed to the Columbus State Mental Hospital in Columbus, Ohio. She then, the mother, burned her daughter's journal, which contained the complete details about her encounter. On October 13, 1913, after being at the state hospital for exactly 10 months, Idella hanged herself in her hospital room. So we are just amazed that we're able to find so many documented cases of what sound like alien encounters back during this time period, considering that there was such a bias against people talking about this topic. There's a number of other cases. I'm going to skip forward to the 20s so as not to run in trouble with the time, but there was a sighting. You know, UFO events at public spectacles are something that has also fascinated me for a long time. And here was a case from 1913 in Lansing, Michigan, where a whole group of spectators at a racetrack, they were treated to an unexpected spectacle in the heavens above, a fast-moving cylindrical aerial object that zoomed across the sky from south to north before suddenly veering off to the northwest and climbing. The article in the Lansing, Michigan State Journal said so swiftly that the strange craft traveled that it was not more than 3 minutes from the time it was sighted southeast of the city until it had passed from the vision in the northwest. The aerial mystery carried no lights of any description and was too elongated for an ordinary balloon. That's not the actual racetrack where it happened, but it's an example of a racing track of that time period. So the newspaper article goes on to speculate that the object might have been an airship. It might have been a very fast traveling balloon, but there were no known airships in the area. Research was done on this, and a gas-filled balloon could not possibly have been able to move as fast as a witness described this thing moving. So it remains an unknown, and it was well covered by the media, as you can see some examples there. And I just have time for, probably this will be the last story from this part of my presentation, but in 1913, some gentlemen who were prospecting for gold in Montana suddenly became aware of a strange creature standing near them. A small humanoid dressed in brown came up to them, and they hadn't even been aware of its presence. And this humanoid creature spoke to them in what seemed to be perfect English and said, "Peace be with you, my friends," which was, it's an amazing thing to, let me go back. I'm sure it was an amazing thing for them to experience. And then what happened next is even more remarkable. They noticed that this creature had apparently come from a nearby silvery round UFO that had either earlier landed softly on the sandy ground, and that there were other beings like the first one that they saw kind of hovering around, walking around that ship. The airship was nearly 100 feet in diameter, had a dome structure at its center, and also had a small conning tower, which is a raised platform like what you find on naval vessels. Buick noted that the UFO had no wheels, confirming that it was not a land vehicle. As the principal eyewitness looked toward the ship, he saw the other men. And so, another interesting case. And then the creatures told the men that they were from another planet and that they had been spying on the Earth for over 100 years. They were taken inside the spaceship, and they were given a quick lesson on how their craft was able to achieve speeds of 9,000 miles per hour. There was an interesting case I'm just going to briefly mention before we go to the 1920s cases. There was a significant sighting of a large cigar-shaped UFO that took place at Rich Field, which was a World War I military airfield in Waco. It was reported seeing this UFO 125 to 150 feet in diameter. It was seen by soldiers at Rich Field and others. One witness said, a young flight cadet stationed there, he said, "As we were coming from the mess hall after our meal, we suddenly saw approaching the camp what seemed to be a Zeppelin at first glance, came directly overhead and was no more than 500 feet high, So we got an excellent view of it. It had no motors, no rigging, and was noiseless. Okay. So cylindrical, cigar-shaped object. One last thing I'm going to mention: we've all been fascinated with the new disaster that has happened at the site of the Titanic disaster. Unfortunately, the loss of the crew of the submersible this week. But what a lot of people don't realize is when back in 1912, when the Titanic went down, survivors who were on the lifeboats watching the Titanic sink into the Atlantic, there were reports of strange objects in the sky and strange lights that seemed to be approaching the surface of the water around the ship. And one of the interesting survivor accounts was that of a young science teacher named Edward Beasley, who said he saw a strange display of what he called stars in the sky that seemed unusually near and very bright. In fact, they seemed to be so near and so close to the horizon that the survivors were often deceived into thinking they were the lights of nearby ships. So, some of these descriptions of what the survivors in the life raft saw seem to suggest that perhaps the sinking of the ship was being observed by unknown entities. We don't know if that's possible, but it could be possible that the sinking of the Titanic, one of the most pivotal events in human history, which is studied and people care about it even today, is it possible that this historical event of monumental proportions in human history was being observed by unknown beings hovering in airships nearby? If so, were these beings from another planet or perhaps from another time period? Whoever they might have been, they obviously had a clear directive that prevented them from interfering in the events that were tragically unfolding that night. They were forced to watch helplessly as 1,500 human lives were taken before their eyes. Food for thought. People tell me, well, you're speculating. Yes, that is speculation. But reading through some of those eyewitness accounts, it's interesting the way they describe these lights that would come down nearly to the surface of the water. UFO cases in the 20s. There are way more than I have time to cover tonight. I could do an entire presentation on the time period that I just covered, and then another one on the 20s, and an entire one on the 30s. So I'm just going to skim through it. There was a very interesting UFO crash near Okmulgee, Oklahoma in June 1920, which was, the research for it was done by Lincoln La Paz, who ended up being one of the world's foremost authorities on UFOs, and was involved many years later in studying the Roswell, New Mexico UFO crash in 1947. Lincoln La Paz, during the 1920s, was a young astronomer, and he was often the first person called, a lot of times by the U.S. government, to go and investigate when a strange object had fallen, meteor or not. So in this case, Professor La Paz stated that the object was a bright blue color until it exploded, burst into leaping flames of red, like an airplane fire, as it dashed downward from the heavens. So, let's see. There's a picture in the lower right corner of Lincoln La Paz from 1922. They call this the crash of an airplane. However, eyewitness descriptions are clear that it could not have been an airplane. So as I mentioned, La Paz went on to be a major UFO investigator. He studied the so-called green fireball UFO sightings in the late 1940s in New Mexico, the Roswell UFO incident, and many other cases. One of the preeminent investigators of UFOs. So we found it interesting to see him involved in this early case of something strange coming out of the sky and crashing in Oklahoma. Other UFO crashes have been reported during this time period, including one in Iowa City, Iowa. What's interesting about this case is that people found the wreckage, and but they couldn't determine exactly what the propulsion system might have been, or if the part that was the engine or the propulsion system might have fallen out prior to the main part of the wreckage. So another interesting case. This was a case that intrigued John, my co-author, and myself. There was a UFO landing that was multiple witnesses in a cotton field near Bethel, North Carolina. There was a family picking cotton, and suddenly an object which the witnesses described as looking like two pie pans placed together, lip to lip. Well, in our day, we would call this a typical metallic disc-shaped UFO, which in the, many people didn't know that these types of sightings occurred prior to the 40s. So this silver UFO zigzagged across the sky and finally came to rest in front of them. And the next part is even more interesting. The startled farm workers watched as a door opened on the hull of the ship. Two humanoid creatures appeared out of the ship's interior and moved to the ground. They were described as little bald white men. They were about the size and stature of an 8 to 10-year-old boy. They were the size of little boys, but their faces seemed older. Within moments, the UFO powered up and took off into the sky, resuming the zigzagging motion they had observed earlier. It's funny, but one of the observers later stated that she thought it might have been some kind of U.S. government experiment. We all thought it had something to do with the government, she said. I mentioned UFO abductions that occurred long before Betty and Barney Hill. Here's another one, happened out at sea. This is a famous case of an ocean-going vessel named the Carol A. Deering, a 5-masted commercial schooner out of Boston, that was found run aground with the entire crew gone, not a trace of them, no bodies ever found, no pieces of bodies, no debris from the wreckage. It wasn't wrecked, the ship was intact. There was no trace of the crew. It was believed at the time that all of the crew and passengers were taken off by another passing ship, but guess what? None of them ever turned up anywhere. They were never accounted for in any way. Sorry. So there's an image of the Carol A. Deering, image taken in January of 1921, U.S. Coast Guard photo. And some of you might be familiar with the famous paranormal researcher of this time period, Charles Fort. And he was intrigued by this case and others like it. The crew of the Carol Deering appeared to have been preparing to have a meal when suddenly they were just gone. Food in the galley was set out like it was being prepared for the next day's meal. Charles Fort wrote, "Crews of vessels have disappeared and vessels have disappeared. It may be that something of which the inhabitants of this earth know nothing is concerned in these disappearances or seizures. It may be that constructions from somewhere else, which was his way of referring to UFOs, which was a term that was not known in this time period. It may be that constructions from somewhere else have appeared upon this earth and have seized crews of this earth's ships. I'm going to skip forward to the 30s sightings because our time is becoming an issue here. There was an early Mothman sighting in 1922. It was very interesting. It's covered in my book. There was a very interesting case involving an encounter with, that was an early Mothman case. There was a very interesting case in Detroit, Michigan, where a couple that was out on a date encountered a UFO. And there was another very interesting encounter that I pulled out, intending to possibly have time to talk about it, that happened in Illinois in 1923. Just to give you an idea of the types of cases that are covered in my book on UFOs of the 1920s, 300-foot-long UFO near Chicago, Illinois. And, you know, human air travel was starting to happen in the 1920s in earnest, and there were, you know, a lot of people starting to take to the sky, and there were a lot of fascinating pilot encounters. I've included a couple of most fascinating ones in the book. A very famous in American history early pilot, Bert Acosta, who lived from 1895 to 1954 and taught himself to fly. He set a number of airspeed records and was very famous during his time period. And he had several UFO encounters while flying that are very fascinating to read about. And I also cover those in my book, as well as a number of other airborne UFO encounters of the 20s. This was a very early UFO picture from a picture taken near Cave Junction, Oregon in 1927. Although it is not without controversy, this picture is considered one of the best of America's early UFO pictures. And I sent this to Tom so that he could use it in the publicity for the session tonight. It's a very important to UFO researchers, very important if it's, you know, it hasn't been established 100% to be accurate, but for a long time it's been known as a very early UFO picture. Of course, the technology back in this time period did not exist to be able to fake pictures. Like now, I can go on Photoshop and put a UFO anywhere hovering over the Allen Public Library, you know, no problem at all. But in 1927, there was not that ability to easily doctor pictures. Another fascinating case, shipborne sighting. And we're going to move on to the 1930s and wrap this up and have our Q&A. I appreciate the audience's patience tonight. It's a lot of material. It's fascinating. I've spent years of my life looking at these early UFO cases. Just wanted to bring you a few of the most important ones. So the 1930s cases are highlighted, in my mind, by the preparations for going into World War II. The United States would soon be drawn into this worldwide conflict involving who we consider to be the bad guys, Nazi Germany. And in our research into UFO cases during this time period, we find something very interesting about Germany, which had an impact on America's involvement in the war. But before that, the decade started with strange sightings of mystery aircraft that were called ghost flyers. Now, the assumption was that they were some kind of, highly advanced aircraft, because the maneuvers that they would make and the speeds that they would go, the aerial acrobatics that they would perform were way beyond the capabilities of any of the aircraft of the time. So, British author Rupert Matthews says, when seen in daylight, the ghost flyers took the form of extremely large aircraft, bigger than anything then flying, colored gray and without markings of any kind. At night, the aircraft often shone dazzlingly bright searchlights down to the ground. The ghost flyers usually came alone, but sometimes appeared in groups of 2 or 3. It soon became clear that the ghost flyers were performing aerobatics and achieving speeds utterly impossible to any known aircraft. So here is just the part that I'm covering here. It soon became clear that those ghost flyers were not like any known aircraft, and with hindsight, it seems that the maneuvers that they were carrying out would be impossible even in our day today, says Mr. Matthews, author Matthews. So these mysterious ghost flyers kicked off the decade of the 30s. They were never seen to land, had no markings, and were seen to operate at low altitude in weather conditions such as heavy snow, which would seem to have been nearly impossible for aircraft of that era, given the primitive de-icing and instrument navigation technology of the time. So the description of them is amazing, and some of the accounts said the aircraft may have had as many as 8 engines, which no aircraft had at that time. Okay, so back to Nazi Germany's involvement in paranormal theories involving the reptilian race of extraterrestrials. So our research uncovered that Nazi hierarchy officials believed that their so-called Aryan race was descended from extraterrestrials who had arrived on Earth eons ago. And these individuals in the German hierarchy viewed themselves as having a special destiny as a result of these extraterrestrial roots that set them apart from all other races and belief systems on our planet. The British newspaper Daily News said, researchers claim senior members of the Thule Society believed a master race of alien beings, reptilian in appearance, were living in underground caverns right here on Earth. This subterranean society, called the Vril Ya, was said to have developed futuristic technology far beyond the reach of humans, including a liquid energy source known as Vril. Vril could power machines and also had awesome destructive power. Now, what's interesting about this is the research into the supposed extraterrestrial technologies of this ancient race of reptilian humanoids led Germany to make an all-out effort to do research and study into creating weapons of war based on these technologies. So, there were alleged experimentations into the creation of saucer-shaped craft, aircraft of an exotic design. Some researchers believe that a series of UFO sightings in Eastern Europe in the 1930s led the Nazis to become even more interested in UFOs and led them to become focused on the idea that they could exploit alien technology to gain power and control over the other nations of the earth. They say that this belief led to the Nazis embarking on many efforts to invent rockets. We know that Nazi Germany perfected rocket science. After the war, Nazi scientist Hermann Oberth, considered the father of the Nazi rocket program, said this. He said, "We cannot take credit for our record advancement in certain scientific fields alone. We have been helped by the people of other worlds," he said. "It is my thesis that flying saucers are real and that they are spaceships from another solar system. There is no doubt in my mind that these objects are interplanetary craft of some sort. I and my colleagues are confident that they do not originate in our solar system." So from there, we're familiar with the story. Leading Nazi rocket scientist Wernher von Braun was developing and test-firing rockets as early as 1934. We all know this is the same Wernher von Braun that later created America's space program, became director of NASA. The rocket technology developed by Braun and his Nazi colleagues continues today to fuel our efforts to take humankind beyond the earth to other worlds and eventually to the stars. Historians are convinced that if Nazi Germany had been given a few more years, they would have achieved technological mastery over all the nations on the earth. They would have more fully developed rockets, they would have created atomic bombs, and it's likely they would have perfected some of the other esoteric, exotic technologies that they were in the middle of trying to create when the world came to when the World War came to an end. And I'm going to have to close now, but let me just cover the so-called famous Die Glocke, or Nazi bell. It was a scientific experiment that the Nazis were carrying out, supposedly trying to crack the secrets of anti-gravity propulsion for aircraft. But researchers have said that it had an unsettling side effect of displacing or disrupting space and time around the object. It created this massive energy field around it that seemed to displace space and time in the immediate vicinity of the object. And what's very, very interesting, and UFO researchers have jumped on this, that in the years that followed, there were sightings of of Nazi bell-shaped UFOs. In other words, Die Glocke-shaped UFOs seen throughout the world in various places. Two of the most notable, and one that's covered in my book, in Cherryville, Pennsylvania in 1933, and later in Kecksburg, Pennsylvania in 1965, another Nazi bell-shaped UFO that crash-landed near Kecksburg. There's an image of the so-called Nazi bell, an artist's rendition, and the person who was in charge of the program. Here are some sightings of Nazi bell-type UFOs. And in closing, I just want to mention that my book contains a number of other very interesting sightings, including this one from Texas in 1930, where a lady was driving along in her vehicle and she encountered a landed UFO and several beings that the best description she could come up with is that their suits appeared to be almost like Boy Scout uniforms. And the creatures were about 5 feet tall, maybe up to 6 feet, and they were able to communicate with her without moving their lips and without making sound. They seem to be like, they seem to have a smaller build, something like children, although they also seem to be like adults. They had very large slanted eyes, large cheekbones, and thin lips. They seemed to be smiling at her, but they didn't actually ever speak. So the encounter goes on. And the very last thing I'm going to talk about, and then we'll open it up to some questions. There was this story about a recovered UFO and alien bodies preserved in large glass jars, the bodies, in a secret chamber under the U.S. Capitol building in 1935. It sounds like science fiction, I know, and I thought so too when I first encountered this. But what's interesting is that the story comes from the daughters of Reverend Turner Hamilton Holt, and historical documentation records that he was a cousin of U.S. Secretary of State Cordell Hull, who served under President Franklin D. Roosevelt from 1933 to 1945. So, according to Lucille and Aline Holt, they were each told independently by their father on separate occasions that Cordell Hull personally showed Reverend Holt a wrecked circular craft and 4 large glass jars holding creatures that looked somewhat human but were not. These artifacts were stored in a sub-basement of the U.S. Capitol building in Washington, D.C. in 1935. The sisters were told this story in 1948 when Holt was serving as minister at the Shenandoah Christian Church in Greenwich, Ohio. And Holt was born in 1894 and died in 1960. Oops, sorry. This is Cordell Hull. And these are the sisters, Lucille and Aline Holt, who tell this story about what happened. They were interviewed by a MUFON researcher in the year 2000. According to the sisters, Reverend Holt was taken by Secretary Hull down to the sub-basement of the U.S. Capitol to a secret room. Inside the lighted room, Reverend Holt was shocked to see 3 or 4 large glass jars that were on top of some kind of stand. Floating inside the jars in what Holt assumed was formaldehyde were bodies of, quote, little people. Holt later told his daughters they were like people, but they weren't. They had all the same things that we have, but it seemed to me like their heads were a little too large for their body. I think their eyes were bigger than ours. As far as the height of the bodies, Holt estimated they were about 4 feet. So, food for thought. I tell people that listen to my talks not to take anything that I say without doing their own personal research. There's a lot of information out there that can be obtained, and I appreciate you all have been a very kind audience to listen to all this presentation of my research tonight. We're going to have a question and answer session at this time.
I'm going to let Stratton and Alex ask the first questions. Then I will bring the mic down to you.
First of all, Noah, thanks for that fantastic presentation. I think you're right that these are stories that get less attention than a lot of stuff. I have probably 100 questions. You're an authority.
Only 100?
Only one.
And I wanted to open up to the audience soon, but I think I wanted to kind of continue on the note you ended on, which is sort of the role of the U.S. government in many UFO stories. If you read enough of these stories, contemporary throughout the 20th century, some even earlier, you can't go too far without running into the U.S. government in some form or fashion. I know in other books you've addressed the topic of kind of the so-called Men in Black. When you look at these cases in the early 20th century, or even before, what other evidence is there, or other stories involving government officials investigating these kind of paranormal events?
Before you answer the question, his books are available in the back. They're $20 each. He's throwing in the tax tonight only, and you get to have it signed. But they are available for purchase in the back.
The involvement of the U.S. government in UFO investigations dates way back to the 1800s. We found evidence of government agents showing up at the sites of encounters. And for example, a very famous example is the Aurora incident here in Aurora, Texas in 1897. There was a government agent on hand who was J.T. Weems, who was speculating that the entity that was found in the wreckage might have been from Mars. So we find it interesting that whoever the established authorities, not just in the United States, but throughout the world, whoever is viewed by the citizenry as an established authority, be it scientific or governmental, is usually contacted and brought in. In the case of Roswell, New Mexico, the local Roswell Army airfield was contacted about the wreckage out at the Foster Ranch, 100 miles north of Roswell. And they were, pieces of the wreckage were brought to the Air Force because they were the presumed authorities on everything flying. There was no U.S. Air Force at that time. It was the Army Air Force. So, yeah, the involvement, it's fascinating, and it's not, I don't see it as a deep, dark conspiracy where the government has a playbook that it runs to cover up. I don't see it as much as there seems to be an underlying current in all societies, not just in the United States, to preserve the status quo and to keep things which have no explanation kind of on the back burner, so that the public doesn't become alarmed or start thinking that the edges of reality are becoming untethered, So there's an effort to maintain the status quo and to try to explain away things as there must be a rational explanation to this that happened. We don't know what it is right now, but there must be. So, yeah, very good question. Thank you, Alex.
So Noah, I've been a trial lawyer for 40 plus years. And as a trial lawyer, we deal in evidence that a judge decides whether to admit it or not in a court of law. So I am obsessed with finding evidence of these craft, of these bodies, of the abductions. Coupled with that, my healthy skepticism is an optimism that such evidence will be found at some point. In our first installment of this series 2 weeks ago, Alex and I talked about how many billions of Earth-like planets there are in the universe, and right now the NASA has the Webb telescope, which is searching to the far beyonds of the universe. So clearly there seems like the odds are there's intelligent life in the universe besides us. And some could argue we're not that intelligent. But getting back to my original thought about evidence, I actually offered a reward for the missing headstone of the pilot, not of this Earth, that we know was at the Aurora Cemetery but has gone missing. And I originally offered $1,000, and as Daniel knows, I saw him in Aurora a few years ago, and I upped that reward to $5,000 for the missing headstone. And I was on Art Bell's show, I was on many shows, because I was actually putting my money where my mouth was. I wanted to see this evidence. And I got lots of calls and lots of interest, but nothing ever materialized that I could consider to be anything close to evidence or the headstone. So my question to you is, with with your research, which is very methodical and truly, truly fascinating, and I applaud you for documenting all of these sightings over the course of all these decades, where is the hard artifacts? Where is the evidence of the crashes? And Alex asked you about government involvement and so forth, but where is it? It seems like there would be some evidence that you could bring to us and say, this is from this crash in 1930 or 40. So where is the evidence?
Well, what's interesting is this story that just has come out in the past couple of weeks about the government, former Air Force intelligence officer that says that there are rooms full of UFO crash debris and bodies. And then we have this story from the 1930s about, there was this labyrinth of rooms down below the U.S. Capitol building where there was crashed UFOs. And we have been, we've been hearing that at some of our military bases, Area 51 springs to mind, that there are craft that are being studied to try to determine how the technology works. So that's another aspect of Alex's question regarding how governments become involved with these cases, because if the government can harvest any sort of technological windfall from studying these craft and their occupants, that could make an impact in that government's military or in just advancing the technology. So it's possible that there are rooms full of this stuff. One interesting thing about your offer for the headstone that went missing in the 70s, I believe that there must be pieces of that crashed UFO that landed in Aurora stuck in somebody's attic somewhere in North Texas. I mean, one of the articles that was published in the newspaper says that people came from miles around to gape at the wreckage. They took pieces of it with them. So all this stuff just disappeared. Now, in someone's attic, there could be this metallic, broken up metallic piece that they have no idea now, all these decades later, where it came from or what its significance is, but it's there. That could be the answer to your question. People have forgotten what it's all about.
Yeah, we're looking for the smoking gun, the piece of evidence that you cannot argue with, that is just going to blow it all out of the water and bring clarity to all of these great stories and mysteries that we're all dealing with. Alex?
I'm going to push us into the realm of speculation a little bit. I know that's not somewhere you always want to go with this kind of thing, but you've documented, dozens, if not hundreds of these cases. You've read a lot of literature, a lot of stories, a lot of research on it. When you look at these stories in aggregate in the 20th century, before, when you kind of get into the realm even of folklore, what sort of commonalities stand out to you, and how have these stories evolved over time? And does that tell you anything perhaps about the nature of the phenomenon, whatever it might be?
Well, what I find very interesting is there are so many common threads, whether the story happened in the 1800s or it happened in Las Vegas a couple of weeks ago. Strange humanoid beings appear, a ship is seen falling from the sky or landing, and then people see strange creatures who behave strangely. And more importantly, they don't seem to leave a trace of their appearance. The vehicle that they arrive in just mysteriously disappears, and they themselves are nowhere to be seen when the officers arrive. But the common threads are amazing. You can go back and read stories just like this from the 1800s, from America's Old West time period, from the founding of our country, from other places we have focused in on the United States because we had the best documentation, the best historical sources, but there were sightings from all over the world during this same time period, even prior to the 1800s. So people saw the same craft. There were reports even of metallic saucer-shaped craft in the 1800s, even though they weren't as common as after 1947. But it's amazing how all these stories are similar and people's reaction to what they experience is similar. The abduction cases, very similar. You can read Idella Ford's abduction story from the 30s and compare it to what Betty and Barney Hill, Travis Walton, and many other abductees have felt and seen and experienced. You know, Travis, to this day, he's an amazing guy to hang out with. I've had the pleasure to spend a lot of time with him. He has been deeply affected by his experience being aboard that UFO for a week before being brought back to Earth. It has affected his entire life. The incident happened to him when he was in his late 30s, early 40s, and now he's in his 70s. And he continues thinking about it, trying to assess what happened, reliving every moment of his abduction experience. In speaking to Betty and Barney Hill's niece as well, she said that Betty and Barney went, her aunt and her aunt's husband, Barney, they went to their graves still trying to determine what it was that it all meant that happened to them that evening when they were taken aboard the craft. So, yeah, it's a fascinating, and the threads are common. It's part of the human experience way back for centuries, and it continues today.
Yeah, I would say even going back millennia, since the dawn of recorded human history, which 10,000, 15,000 years from the very first cave paintings are very strange objects that are very mysterious and curious for sure. So you mentioned in your remarks earlier, Noe, that you had a family sighting that fired your imagination and got you very interested in UFOs and aerial phenomena. Could you describe that for us?
Yeah, my mom had an encounter in the 1940s that's actually been written up in a couple of books. But in the 1940s, she heard a commotion in the middle of the night. My dad was working in construction and was out of state at the time. This happened in South Texas, near McAllen, Texas. And in the 1940s, that whole area where I grew up, I wasn't born at the time this happened, but where my parents lived at that time was extremely dark at night. There were very few light sources, and it was orange and grapefruit trees, orchards all around my family's home. So she went out to the back of the house, seeing these lights and hearing these noises, and this craft appeared over her head. At that time, my mom and dad had a lot of different kinds of animals. They had goats, and they had their pet dogs and chickens and roosters, and it was just a farmyard situation. And all the creatures were greatly agitated. The dogs were jumping up in the air and snapping their jaws. And my mom said that this craft, she could see the influence of the whatever propulsion system or whatever mechanism this craft had on the trees swaying all around her. And she saw this light. The whole area around her was illuminated. And the dogs were just going crazy and jumping up in the air. And try as she might, her neck muscles were locked in place, and she could not direct her gaze upward to see what it was that was above her. She tried, she wanted to see, and could not. So she said she fell on her knees in an attitude of prayer because she was very scared. And then the most amazing part of the story to me, she said it was as if someone turned off a light switch. The illumination was gone in an instant. the swirling trees from whatever the air that was being rushed down stopped, and all the animals went still and quiet. The dogs stopped barking, and everything was just still in the night. So she used to tell me this story, and I was just fascinated. Like, what could this have been? I grew up in the 60s, and UFOs were in all the literature. And so I would run to the library, the public library and my school library, and check out every book on UFOs, Tom. Every single one. If you had gone looking for a UFO book, it'd be out to some guy named Torres. Now, I read all those books. There were wonderful people writing wonderful books about UFOs back in the 60s, and became fascinated with the topic. Then later, Eric von Däniken and his theories about ancient astronauts. So this is a topic that's been near and dear to me for a long time.
I'm not going to ask a question, make a comment. Secretary Hull was a very well-respected statesman and close confidant of Franklin Roosevelt.
Yes.
So we're not talking about somebody who just flew in and I mean, he had a long, stable history.
Yes, he did. So that's a fascinating story, and it's one of the stories in my book that I've gotten the most comments about.
Questions, comments, protests. This is a library. You can say what you want. Here's a question. If you, whoa, you got to speak into the microphone.
Are you familiar with the report that Stephen Greer just put out last week? What are your thoughts on it, if you did?
I'm sorry, I've been doing other research projects, and I'm not familiar with that, but I know that Dr. Greer does fascinating work, and most of what he puts out is just incredible. So yeah, I'm sure whatever he talked about was very, very interesting. I'll look it up, yeah.
Questions, comments, protests. If you look at me, you're going to have to question. There you go, in the back. This is like the auction house. Raise your hand and it's yours.
Thank you. I love the story about the alien that came up to the man and said, peace be with you, like he was Jesus, but he was not Jesus, because we know what Jesus looked like, and these creatures didn't look like Jesus. Yes, I think they are from a different dimension. They might be fallen angels. They might be demons. I think we have to be very careful. And
I think you're right. People always tell me, well, I've always wanted, they say something like, I've always wanted to approach these guys and go talk to them. And I say, I wouldn't do that if I were you.
What if they're here to try to do some good?
I have heard too many straight up eyewitness accounts of their encounter with these beings, and 99% of them are not pleasant. I'm sorry. I know we're waiting for the peace-loving aliens to come and solve all our problems, but this ain't it.
I like your mom's story, where as soon as she began to pray, they were gone.
To your point, the U.S. Air Force intelligence officer, which is involved in this whistleblower situation involving the craft that have according to him, been re-engineered by the U.S. Air Force into military aircraft, these beings do come from another dimension. They're not necessarily extraterrestrial. He believes, or he has said, at least according to the news reports, the latest one I read was June 12th, so it's very recent, said that they are really us coming back from the future and are conducting experiments or doing whatever they're doing. But he also said this, that's very interesting to your point, is that their intentions are not necessarily benevolent. In fact, he said they are malevolent. And as you know, there's a big difference. Now, I don't think they're out to destroy us, otherwise we probably wouldn't be here, and that probably would have happened a while ago. But you can't necessarily trust that their intentions are to help us. They have their own agenda Otherwise, they wouldn't be here messing with us and conducting whatever they're doing and then potentially abductions and so forth.
And I think that's the key. They have an agenda that we don't understand. They are vastly indifferent to us. They seem very cold and calculating, and they don't want to have any involvement other than what suits whatever purposes they are carrying out, because they have some agenda that they're following. And it involves studying us to some extent. It involves what we would call scientific research. But it's not clear to us what they are doing here or what their purpose is, much less what their origin is. So yeah, it's best to approach this with great caution, is what I tell people. I've heard too many horror stories from people who have had verified encounters.
Hello. I have a question for Noah. What's your thoughts about the theory that all these craft that we see are in fact visitors from the future, and the aliens we see are humans that have evolved over the centuries? Thank you.
Well, here's the thing, and I meant to mention this earlier, but I've spoken to a lot of people in doing my books and a lot of eyewitnesses. And the thing about these creatures is that they do not appear to be sentient biological entities. They appear to be some type of manufactured in a lab creature. I don't know if you'd call them cyborgs, aliens. My understanding is, based on the people who have had close-up views and interactions with them, is they do not appear to have a reproductive system. They do not appear to have a digestive system. They don't appear to have fully functioning mouths, such that you could eat. They could eat. They appear to be some sort of genetically modified or genetically manufactured creature that's sent to Earth, possibly because this is the form in which they can most efficiently function upon our planet. Whereas their masters, whoever it is that's actually controlled, they are drones, and their masters, whoever it is that's controlling them, are the ones that are behind the whole thing, but they, for whatever reason, have chosen not to make an appearance themselves. So they send these probes or these drones to our planet. So I don't know about the time travel theory. Maybe these entities have some knowledge of what our future is like. Maybe they have the capability of foreknowledge of our world's history. Perhaps they themselves can travel in time through some technology that we have no knowledge of ourselves, through some revelation in physics that they've uncovered. It certainly is possible. But what fascinates me is the aspect of these creatures that's described by almost universally by UFO witnesses, that they do not appear to be sentient biological beings. They appear to be some kind of robotic, cyborg, android type drones.
Yeah, I've been watching some of these alien shows, and I saw one just last week, and it showed how the technology has changed in the last 60 years, and they say some of that might be technology from the alien saucers. The question I got is, they also showed up a map of where all the crashes have turned up, and I think we counted 14. And my question, they're so advanced, how come they keep crashing?
Their craft, well, first of all, there's a number of explanations possible here, and I don't know, of course, for sure what's going on with that, but there have been these beings that pilot these craft, in my opinion, are not sentient beings. They are just drones. The craft are sent from an environment that is not like the Earth to our Earth, and may be subject to navigation errors, electromagnetic interference from conditions on this planet as opposed to where they're from. There's a lot of variables here. Like they are not, I would not consider them necessarily to be incapable of errors or fallacies, especially given that they're operating in an environment that they are totally unfamiliar with. And they're being controlled basically by remote, in my opinion, based on my research. And these beings that appear on our planet are not sentient beings. They're being controlled by their masters who are off planet. So that's how I would explain it. They're subject to catastrophic errors and faults, interference from electromagnetic fields and other. They say that the Roswell craft went down after it was struck by lightning, for example, one of the nature's most powerful electrical forces. So, no, they're not flawless. They're not beyond fault. Very good question, and I get that a lot.
Over here.
I appreciate you coming out. I had a question regarding about the crash in Brazil in '96. A lot of witnesses saw a Tic Tac that crashed, and they described the creatures, the grays, having the smell of ammonia and sulfur. I would like to know, in your research, have you came across of that same type of characteristics of they smelled like a bad odor of ammonia and sulfur?
Those are like smells that are associated with like demons or the devil, yeah. No, I had not heard about that particular case. It's interesting though, in the research that I've done, there's very little mention of smells associated. There's always visual cues. There's lights, there's sounds a lot of times, there's sounds. Very few people, very few UFO witnesses have mentioned smells to me. And I was thinking as you were asking the question now, I've spent a lot of time with Travis Walton. I can't recall him ever mention, he describes the craft, what he saw aboard the craft, he described the beings on the ship. He never mentioned smells. The
director, named James Fox, called Moments of Concern.
Let me bring the mic to you.
Was that Jamie Foxx that you were talking?
James Fox.
Yeah, James Foxx, yeah.
Called Moment of Contact. Yes. And he went out to Brazil, and okay. So to follow up with your answer was that moments of contact? Yeah. Jamie's Fox. And he went out there, and everybody said the same answer was it smelled so bad from people, the Army, the 3 girls that witnessed the creature, to the witness that saw the crash. It smelled like ammonia and sulfur.
Interesting.
And that was the first time I've ever heard of this before.
I think I'm getting the concept to do a book on smells associated with UFO sightings. Yes, I don't think anybody's done that.
This question is from one of our younger guests.
I've heard that there are 2 kinds of aliens, good and bad. Have you heard of that, and what do you think of it? Is it true?
Thank you very much for your question. I speak at schools a lot, and so I enjoy questions that the students always, and they ask me some of the most fascinating questions, the kids in the schools. Are there 2 kinds of aliens, good and bad? Now, when you started your question about different kinds of aliens, I thought you were going to ask a question that people always ask me, that, we always think of aliens as the little 4-foot-tall gray aliens with the big black slanted eyes and the big head, oversized head. And then people always ask me, are there other kinds than that? Yes, they have identified 8 major types of UFO occupants. The 8 include the grays. And there's everything from the little gray aliens that we're all familiar with to aliens that look just like you or me, humanoids, but they have some telltale signs, like their skin is very pale. They seem to always wear eyewear, typically sunglasses. But as far as good versus evil, not really. Almost all of the people that have come to face with these creatures, they get a sense that they're doing some kind of study on humans. They don't know exactly what they're studying about us, but they don't seem to particularly care one way or another about us. They wouldn't be viewed as trying to do good to us or trying to do bad to us. They're just more or less indifferent, like they don't really care. They're just doing their thing. They've been sent to our planet to carry out these experiments, and then they go back to wherever they came from. Anyway, that seems to be the general feeling that people tell me they get from these creatures.
Thanks, Noe. So this has been great to have you out and to present on the lesser known cases earlier on. And just a quick comment and then a question. So someone asked about Dr. Greer's event here recently, and I just thought I'd share that a colleague of ours, Michael Stratton, who was a presenter, shared about 2 pretty incredible cases that happened in seemingly the 50s and then the 70s, which is based upon largely on Noe's research. One referred to as the Del Rio case and the Cayome case, which Noe, you've written about extensively in 2 books. I just wanted to make a mention of that as well. And being that we have all these things happening in the media and in the news, and there seems to be a great deal of interest and resurgence in a lot of these topics, what are your thoughts on the idea of this sort of current disclosure process underway on all sides? From the government, you have people coming forward, as you mentioned, David Grush, the whistleblower, giving this testimony. You have the government's program ARROW, the All Domain Anomaly Resolution Office, who's saying that there doesn't seem to be any real strong evidence of anything extraterrestrial. On the other hand, you have this figure, Grush, coming forward saying we have craft, we have bodies. And then you have civilian efforts, MUFON, other organizations, and some that you mentioned earlier. Where do you find all this is leading to? Do you think that this idea of disclosures will be happening through the government, through science, through the public? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, that's a very interesting question, and I get that a lot. But Daniel, before I go into that, I want to invite everybody here, if you're really, really interested in this topic. It's a long way to drive. I know, because I just made the drive the other way. But we have the 11th annual Edinburgh UFO Conference in Edinburgh, Texas. That's way down in the Rio Grande Valley. And we've had great speakers. We've had Travis Walton on multiple occasions, Michael Schratt. We've got our conference this year, August 11th and 12th. Friday night is an outdoor festival. It's kind of a fun deal for the whole family. And then Saturday is all day of lectures with some of the top UFO people. Daniel has been our MC the past few years and has helped out with the presentations.
He seems so articulate, I can see why he's a good MC.
So Daniel, I'm assuming you're involved again yeah. So I know he's there even before he became involved, and he used to attend and help out. So we appreciate that.
I'm going to ask a quick question, and then I'm going to let Stratton and Alex close us out. It seems, just cursory review, during World War II, not many sightings. Am I wrong, or?
We had a lot of the Foo Fighter sightings, which they were these strange orbs of light that followed some of our military aircraft, not just ours, but the other. The Germans thought that they were ours, and we thought they were the Germans or Japanese, and they ended up being neither. So There were a lot of, we didn't cover the, because that gets into the 40s, and we cut it off at 39. But yeah, that's an interesting study. I'm sure there's been books of UFO sightings during World War II. There were a significant number, though, and it mainly involved military aircraft. So good question.
Alex, go ahead, and I'll wrap it up.
Yeah, I just want to thank you again, Noe, for the great presentation. Thank you, Stratton, for 2 weeks ago for walking us through a lot of interesting ancient cases and sites that you've seen personally.
Before you ask the question, they presented a UFO program on the ancients 2 weeks ago. That will be on YouTube in about a week. UFOs and the Ancients with Stratton and Alex. So watch it. Go ahead, Alex.
And I wanted to thank all y'all for coming out. I've enjoyed, just as a journalist, as a writer, as someone who's written a little bit about UFOs, but not too extensively, learning more by listening to the experts here. I think, you know, wherever you stand on the phenomenon, on UFOs as an idea, they make for great stories, and that's what I love about them as a storyteller, as a writer, as a journalist. And what I also love is the dedication that people who study this, who love UFOs, have to kind of this. It's going to sound corny, but to this abstract notion of the truth, that the truth is out there. It's something you can find if you try and if you look out for it. And that's kind of what I've taken away from the presentation tonight. And I thank y'all for bringing that to light.
Well, it has been a great 2 series on UFOs and the possibilities of what they all might bring. I want to follow up on Daniel's question a little bit, because we covered this a couple weeks ago. And it does seem to me personally, who's been involved in UFOs since I was a young teenager in Charleston, South Carolina, and growing up being a lawyer and filtering my interest in phenomenon mysteries through a legal lens, it appears that there is some kind of disclosure coming, that there seems to be a preparation for this disclosure. And I think we're in that preparation phase now. Whereas Project Blue Book, and Noe mentioned J. Allen Hynek, Dr. Hynek, who was involved with Project Blue Book, there was so little information coming out from the government that it appeared to be a cover-up of some kind. Most people thought the government knew a lot more than it was revealing in dribs and drabs. So it appears to be with the government, with the scientific community, and many other agencies, outlets, organizations, what have you, that there is a dawning of an understanding that whatever it is needs to be made public. And that I think, I can't tell you when this is going to happen. Someone last week mentioned October of this year. There would be some kind of disclosure forthcoming. I don't know how they know that. I don't know that there's any timing to it. But I think it's coming. And there seems to be, by the government at least, some kind of understanding that the public now needs to know, that it's ready to know, that we have become so wedded to the idea of this possibility that now it's time to fully come clean on what they do know. And I'll go back to these aircraft, these re-engineered aircraft. There's a gap between the F-16 and the stealth fighter. You just look at those 2 aircraft, and there is a missing link somewhere. The stealth fighter looks like something right out of Independence Day, Area 51, but it's not just, it does not look like a human type aircraft. And then you got the B-1 bomber, the B-2 bomber, and all that. There seems to be some kind of missing link in the development of the military aircraft. And I'm hopeful that this whistleblower case does shed some real light, and maybe this is part of the disclosure that's coming, is going to really show us what really happened and how the military was able to make those leaps in technology to get to that program, the stealth fighters. And then, of course, we're seeing drones and any number of incredible innovations when it comes to aircraft and aviation right now. It's just amazing what's going on.
I was going to follow through on that question. one of the important points you made tonight was Werner von Braun and his analysis and his thoughts on the subject. He was probably, along with Einstein, one of the two most brilliant people that ever lived. As my father used to say, it's a good thing we had both of them on our side, because the Russians were trying to find von Braun at the end of the war. They wanted him on their side, but I think he surrendered to the Americans so he wouldn't have to be with the Russians, as I recall the story. But I mean, this is a man that's just so phenomenally brilliant, and for him to make that statement is not something to be minimized.
And then we have this movie Oppenheimer coming out very soon. That's going to be a fascinating movie too, about the development of the atomic bomb. And so yeah, there's brilliant minds, far more brilliant than mine, have kind of noodled this. And it's fascinating to read what they've written about it. I think we have to be open-minded to the possibilities of there being extraterrestrial life and other planets. It's highly evolved and far more intelligent than we are. Whether they have actually touched us, been with us, or helped us, or even hurt us, I don't know. But I think we are going to find out soon enough what the current body of knowledge is that's kind of been held back from us for so long. The big reveal is coming, I think.
Is there one last question to the audience? We have just 1 or 2 more minutes. One last question. It's at the auction house. Being none.
We're questioned out.
Finally, gone.
I'm going to go buy 3 of his books because I want to read all about these great.
Thank y'all for coming.
Stories.
Alex Macon, Stratton Horres, and Noe Torres.